the threat of sexual violence that women live under, it sucks. Even a guy who would never do something like that, he's living in the shadow of men who are. A big part of consent is attunement. Like, when we define masculinity through this idea of like conquering and through this idea of like never experiencing rejection, to experience rejection can fill men with extreme shame. So then they're not really open to the no. They're scared of it. I want to make sure like that you feel comfortable to say no and that you know I'm respecting that. That is going to be so much more effective than what any of these pickup artist guys tell you.
Welcome to the Authentic Man podcast. I am your host, David Chambers. This is a podcast for men who want more and less from life. More deep connection, more emotional intelligence, more self-awareness, and more great sex. And less heartache, less conflict, less overthinking, and less stress. Creating dating lives, sex lives, and relationships that are incredible and authentic. My deepest goal is that you, the listener, can take away what you hear in this podcast and apply it to your life so that you can experience greater happiness, transformational growth, deeper relationships, and profound sexual intimacy. I believe that as men, we are capable of so much more depth than we are shown or led to believe. So join me as we get deep into this. Welcome back to another episode of the Authentic Man podcast. I'm your host, David Chambers. I'm a men's dating, relationship, and intimacy coach. And in this episode, this is fire. This is like a beautiful end-to-end boxing match, or end-to-end basketball match, or football if you're from my persuasion. Clementine, she really, we just start off in a place of talking about trauma and therapy to start with. And then we kind of get into men in relationships. And, she talks a lot about her background. She's an author and a writer and a speaker and a podcaster as well. And she talks about her life experiences with men at the opposite end, not at the top end privileged man that we often think about men, but actually men who are really in bad places and really struggling with their own trauma, and what that was like for her to be in interaction with those men and how that's kind of influenced her and how she sees men. And we really talk about how she sees men in this width and the struggles that men have, the struggles of men have emotionally, the struggles that men have relationally, the struggles that men have with relationship. And we actually really get into around sex and the stress of initiating, and how, we as society just accept that men have to initiate sex and sexual relations and relationship stuff. And we don't always have much empathy and compassion for the stress that takes on for men. I'm just looking at my notes because I've got like a page of notes, and we just really talk about it, really just go kind of back and forth. And she's an incredible mind with incredible compassion and understanding, nuance. This is a treat of an episode. Like, you're really going to enjoy this one. Like, if this is your jam to understand men better and what they go through. And if you're a man, this is a great episode for you to listen to and realize that you're not alone, And we're even getting to things like, beauty standards and how they upheld themselves, and if it's really men that want these things or it's just kind of being projected onto them. And we really talking about an empowered masculinity where, you're self-referencing, you're not referencing from how society wants you to be. So it's an absolutely phenomenal conversation. I hope you enjoy this one. If you're listening to this and you're interested in any of the work that I do as a man, I work with men one-to-one, but also in groups. I've got a program that is operating, I say, in February. So if that's something you're interested, let me know. Other than that, I'm working with men. I'm taking on clients one-to-one as well. But I'm going to let you get into this episode because this is absolute fire. You're going to love this. This is going to be a beautiful listen to if you're on a drive or on a run, because you're going to get so much goodness out of it. I'll let you get into the episode. So listeners, I'm in for a little treat for you this week, but also a treat for me. Sometimes you speak to people who you followed on Instagram and you read their stuff and you're like, man, I love that, man. I wish I said smart things like that more often. I have a wonderful guest with me, a woman who has lived a really varied life, and talks about topics, a really wide range of topics, from everything from dating, relationships, polyamory, feminism, social justice, and everything in between, and the intersection of all of those. And what I love most about the ways that she speaks is the width of compassion for the struggles of all people. Even those people who are maybe what we would call cruel or evil. And I really love that, because I think in this world, what we really struggle for is sometimes having the ability to stand in the shoes of people who we look at and point at and go, you're bad. And I really love her ability to do that across all of things. Hello, how are you doing, Clementine?
Hello, I'm good. Thank you for having me.
How are you doing? You good today?
I'm good today. Yeah. I have a bunch of things going on, but I'm happy to be here. Happy to be talking on the podcast.
Awesome. Thank you. So I like to start with a question with my guests to just get a little understanding of them. And I'm also excited to hear a bit more. Is what was your journey to doing the work that you do now?
It's a huge question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think my work flows out of my life, it flows out of my lived experience. I've always been a writer. I have been writing since I was a little kid. I have been self-publishing since I was a teenager. So I've always written, and I've always used writing as the place where I figure things out, and so my process has always been in writing. I've always been happy to share with the world my own unfolding process. And a lot has happened along the way. And a big part of my story, and a big part of what influences my work, is my experience of trauma. So I grew up having experienced child abuse, and I developed complex PTSD. And many people who are traumatized in this way end up having really crazy lives. And so I had a really crazy life. I became an alcoholic really young. And in my teenage years and the first half of my 20s, I was living a very chaotic, street involved, alcoholic existence, where there was a lot of violence. There was a lot of really fucked up stuff going on. And so that experience, and then coming out of that and getting into recovery, I spent 10 years in AA and lots and lots of therapy. I changed my life, and I got out of the fucked up situations that I was in and really began to heal. But I think that compassion that you were talking about, that is so central to my work, really is influenced by my experience of both having been in that really bad place, and also having been, when you're in that place, you're there with other people, right? And so the people that I knew who were there, many of whom were men, were all fucked up too. And, the guys I was dating at that time were in and out of jail, and were really in horrible places. And many of them were horrible to me. And also I was horrible to them. And we were all really suffering. And having had the opportunity to be in AA, I've really seen people change. And I've really seen people, when they are given resources and compassion and the opportunity to look at themselves, without shame, without condemnation, and with the assurance that their humanity is seen, people really do well in that kind of an environment, and people change. And, in 12-step programs like AA, it's cool because you also see that process happening both with women and with men as well. Men talking about their feelings, men processing what has been done to them, what they have done, and really stepping into responsibility and being able to make amends and make changes. And so I know that that's possible, and I know that people can change, and I know that people behave in fucked up ways because that's where they are. They're suffering. They are dissociated. They are out of touch with themselves. They are out of touch with their empathy. And then it causes them to act in really regrettable ways. But when people receive what they need, people really do, want to step into a better version of themselves. So I feel like that journey is really what influenced my life. And then being like, being a therapy nerd, like having complex PTSD means that like, I was like, all right, so I'm fucking crazy. So what am I going to do about this? Like, how am I going to figure this out? And so, I wanted to understand what was happening in my recovery. And I didn't just want to take the word of like a therapist. I wanted to know what I was doing in therapy and why. And so I ended up reading like all of these books for therapists and really understanding the trauma framework. And then, that leads into stuff about relationships and like attachment theory and like how we are together, not just in our own healing, but in our relationships. And so, yeah, like as I said with my writing, I was always, as I was learning all of this, I was always sharing that practice and taking a lot of what I learned from books that were written for therapists and actually trying to make it accessible to regular people so they can just understand and also feel empowered in their own journeys.
Wow. Wow, it's incredible. It's a whole lot of all these experiences. Until they're like all of this, all these experiences of like, it's not so, like what are the extremes of what some people never really have to go through, and they maybe just see like glimpses of it on their day, like in the streets, or they see a glimpse of it like on a TV program, and they make a lot of assumptions like, oh, look, people are in messed up relationships, and then we like project some stuff like, oh, that must mean that they are X, Y, and Z, but we don't always like stop to kind of go, oh, like what has led to someone to kind of be in these situations in their life. And there was so much. Like I was thinking, I've had a few clients, like men that I've worked with, been through AA, and like so many of them have just said to me like it saved my life. I'd be dead right now, or I'd be in prison, or I had terrible things would have happened. And I remember doing some reading about AA or watching some TV about AA, and I was like, wow, isn't it incredible that there's this organization that runs all across the world, but actually it's not, they're not therapists. Right? They're creating all this profound change in people's lives, and they're not ring fenced by the kind of because like sometimes you feel like therapy wants to like ring fence healing and transformational work and be like, oh, only we can do this. If you haven't got these letters after your name, you're not allowed to talk about these things.
Yes, and I mean that's very important because also in my journey, like I experienced a bunch of psychiatric incarceration, being locked up in psych wards. And my fear of that, my terror of that made me so untrusting of therapy when I first really needed it. I didn't want to go to a therapist because I was like, I don't fucking trust you guys. You're going to fucking lock me up and I don't want to be locked up. And so when I went to AA, I was like, oh, these are just people. Like they're just other people like me. They're not in charge. They don't have that kind of power over me. And it was that equal footing that really opened my heart to the possibility of getting help. And so in that way, it's actually, now I love therapy, like non-psychiatric therapy is my jam. I don't really want to be psychiatrized, but like, yeah, that peer support of just like one alcoholic helping another, I think is like a really beautiful model.
One person that's just slightly further along the path than someone else. You can look back and go like, okay, I've walked some of these steps. I can help you take this next step because I'm maybe one step ahead. And we can see ourselves. I imagine it's easy to see yourself in the person who's trying to help you.
Exactly. And that's the thing. Like when you've had a really crazy life and you're in a really bad place, you don't trust somebody who hasn't had a crazy life because you're like, who are you to tell me anything? You've never been where I've been. So if you hear someone, like that's when I first went to meetings, I was like, oh my God, because the way they talked about their past was specific and detailed enough that I knew they were telling the truth and I knew they had been to the types of places that I was. But I was looking at them and they were all like together and normal seeming and like they weren't like me, right? So I was like, okay, these people have been where I've been and they've gotten out of it. And so that really, it made me trust them. It made me curious about what it is that they had to say because I could tell that they really understood,
Yeah, I could understand. And you said in there, like, that you saw men in these places, right? In the places you were, like when you're in bad places, there are men in the bad places, men doing bad things in the bad places. And then also when you're in AA, there was men in AA doing lots of good things and helping and moving people along.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I bring this up is like I often get met when I'm talking about men, and I'm trying to talk about men in this way in which that they can be loving and compassionate and use their power for good. I'm always met with like, yeah, but men are at the top of the tree, you know, life's easy for a man and all these sorts of things. And I'm like, well, okay, yeah, there's that like thin sliver of man at the top, you know, there's that billionaire guy, you know, 90% of them are men. And then you've got the big pool of men that kind of are not at the top at all and are suffering and are in really bad places. And I guess you've really seen like and experienced that on both sides, really seen it from both sides, those men that are living in that place.
Totally. I mean, it's such a misunderstanding of power, the way that people talk about power that way, right? Because it's true that, like, you know, there are certain things that are more likely to be a disadvantage or a risk for a woman. If both a man and a woman are in the same kind of fucked up situation, there's certain risks, right, that I experienced that men didn't. Like, for example, you know, if I slept outside, my chances of being sexually assaulted is super, super high. Whereas for men, that isn't as much of a thing. But to take that and then to act like that a man in that situation is somehow privileged is a misunderstanding. Because it's like, you know, having a reduced risk of being sexually assaulted on a park bench is not in it of itself a privileged situation. If you are, you know, homeless, you know, in and out of jail, having severe fucking trauma, having addiction, like these men are like at the bottom of the barrel of society. And like the women who are down there are at the bottom of the barrel too, and have added risks of like, you know, sexism, but also there's, you know, like there were men that had experiences that I didn't have, like men who experienced racism that I wasn't experiencing, you know, like situations with police that I wasn't experiencing. So it's, trying to divide power in this way at the bottom and trying to be like all of these people who are all in a suffering situation, let's try to figure out who has the most power. Like, what is the point of that? To me, I'm just like, all of these people are suffering, and the power that we should be looking at is the people at the top who have everything, instead of, you know, trying to pretend like a homeless dude or a guy who's panhandling on the corner has any kind of power to speak of, you know?
Yeah, because that man in that situation, he doesn't feel like he has any power. He feels powerless in the world completely.
Absolutely. And he gets treated like shit all the time, and he's super traumatized, and he doesn't have access to the resources that he needs. And there's this major dehumanization that happens to people in those types of situations, where when we look at people who are really down and out like that, like we are encouraged as a society to dehumanize them, to not feel empathy for them, to walk past them and like not look at them when they're in like abject suffering, you know? And I also think that men, you know, because of the way that men are socialized away from a lot of the range of their emotions, right? Like they're socialized away from vulnerability, from showing their softness, from showing their sadness. And so what that leaves for a lot of men in terms of the emotional range that they're allowed to have is stuff in the anger side of things, right? And so like when you see a really kind of sketchy guy who's, you know, has a really fucked up life, kind of raging out and being kind of scary and threatening, like everybody's just scared of that guy and everybody is just mad at him and thinks that he's a big problem. But that raging out that he's doing, that is scary and threatening to other people, is also an expression of his pain and his deep sense of helplessness in the world. And this is the emotional range that he has to express that. And he doesn't have any power to actually affect change in his circumstances. Like he needs way more resources than he has. And so he's fucking lashing out. And there's a way to understand that while still being like, hey, you're being scary, but at the same time, you're being scary because you're scared, you know? And like, that's something that a lot of people don't see when they're looking at, especially men in that type of a situation.
They just look at them and feel that they experience their own fear of looking at this person being like, oh my God, I have my unconscious biases I have towards someone who looks sketchy that's on the street. Plus I'm also seeing this anger which triggers something in me, like a lack of safety and so forth. And they don't have the ability to be like, this might be the only way he can actually express anything in
Yeah.
this
And
moment.
why is he so angry? What's going on for this guy? You know? And like, we don't ask that. And like, there's this thing, right, where we, you know, as a society, we generally, if I were to tell someone a story about a child being abused, people would be, wow, such compassion, fear about this idea of this young child being abused. Like, we feel compassion towards that. But then when those children grow up, those children are all sketchy. You know, like a lot of people who experience child abuse end up in really bad situations as adults where they are living in poverty, addiction, and they're behaving in lots of chaotic ways. And then we don't have compassion for them. But that's the same person, like that's the same child that we would have compassion for. But when they grow up and their lives manifest what we know, like without a doubt, scientifically, is the result of child abuse for so many people, we don't have compassion for that, you know? And so, you know, when I see someone acting like that, whether it's a woman or a man, like for me, I'm like, what happened to this person? Why is this person in so much pain?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess I see this with like the men that I work with who are, you know, probably pretty like middle class dudes, and they act in ways which are deemed, you know, toxic, harmful, and so forth. And they experience the world. Actually, some of them is just like they're just a bit miscalibrated, like socially. You know, they didn't grow up in an environment in homes where maybe they had used to having lots of guests come around, and they were used to interacting with men and women and people of different ages. So they kind of find themselves in their kind of mid 20s, 30s, and they're not that socially adept, and they could be easily viewed as a bit odd and weird by people. And what they often receive is like they feel this huge shunning from society. But like they also have come from an environment where they had certain levels of trauma because of maybe sexual abuse happened to a young age, or just parental neglect. Like they didn't have that kind of parental neglect. And it's interesting how as a society, we look at those men and we're like very quick to label them as like weird and dangerous without really going, okay, like what's going on with this guy is that he's struggling in this way. Yeah, his life might look okay. He lives in a home on his own with people, and he has a few friends, maybe not that many. He holds down a job, but like some of the intricacies to get the most out of life and relationships, he's unable to really kind of, I don't want to use the word take advantage of, but like get the juice out of.
Yeah. And I mean, I really love the work of Gabor Mate. You know, he started with In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, where he's talking about, you know, this type of person that, you know, I started talking about, people who are really in poverty and addiction and homelessness. And now as he's continued on in his work, and like he was one of the first people to be like, hey, actually addiction is a result of trauma, right? We should have compassion instead of punishing people. But then now his new book, The Myth of Normal, is this like magnum opus that looks at the whole of society and the way that trauma infuses our society, not just the people who are like really fucked up at the bottom of the barrel, but the rest of us too, right? And how, you know, now we understand that trauma is not just these capital T traumas of physical abuse, sexual abuse, really intense and obvious traumas, but they also just come from emotional neglect and misattunement. Like when parents are not able to attune to and actually like show the child you are seen, you are held, you are responded to, then the child does not actually learn how to regulate their own emotions, how to be in connection with other people while still remaining connected to themselves. And so all of this can be very damaging. But because there's not like a big capital T trauma to point to all the time, a lot of people feel really confused as to why it is that they are suffering so much and why it is that they are in so much pain when nothing really happened, you know? But in fact, as like highly social animals, we really require attunement all throughout our lives, but definitely in our childhoods. And if we don't have that, it has really lasting effects on our adulthoods. And so I also think that this is true just in general for everybody. But I think for men, there's like this added layer where like part of socialization for men is literally like to disconnect from your emotions. And so like that is a total lack of attunement because emotions are there to be responded to. Emotions are there to say something is happening and I want a response, especially when you're a little kid. When a little boy is crying, he falls down and he cries. Like, the point of that is to communicate to the world, I'm in pain. And the point is that the parent is supposed to be like, I see you're in pain. And like, are you okay? Let's look at it. Did you skin your knee? Are you feeling okay? And then like help the kid back up to get going, you know? But when the child is responded to with, don't be such a baby, you know, like that is extremely damaging. And it causes confusion inside the child, because the child is now learning, I have to repress this authentic reaction to something that just happened to me. I have to repress it. Otherwise, I will be punished. I will be scolded. I will be excluded. I will be shamed. And so, yeah, like that happens, you know, to all children to varying degrees and in varying ways in the way that we raise children today. But I think for boys, it is a big part of socialization into being a man is actually this profound disconnection from the authentic emotional inner landscape. And that causes damage and it causes confusion, because how can you expect a person who has been socialized over and over again to disconnect from their own emotional experience? How can you expect them to successfully attune to others and to be empathetic and to read body language and to actually be like a very like responsive, connected like friend or partner when they have so thoroughly cut off their own understanding of their own authentic experience? And so when we see men acting in ways that are like very misattuned and very disconnected, part of the reason for that is the way that we have raised boys.
Yeah. And there's some research. For some reason, I cannot remember his name. He did some survey. I think it was in Oakland, high school in Oakland, and saw that that's it, the man box rules. And that there's certain rules that young men realize they have to live by. It's like they need to be strong, they need to be tough, they need to show no weakness, they can't cry, they need to dominate their environments, they need to don't talk about anything deep other than cars and sport. Like they need to dominate women in particular. And he showed that it's like as young boys and girls, when they're running around, they have the same level of emotion to express, and it kind of hits them. I think it's like 7, 8 years old, where they start to be really, as you said, it starts to be like numbed out of them. Like don't feel, don't express, they mock and they bully each other. And by the time they get into the late teens, he was seeing how boys would struggle even to say that like they had a best friend, because they saw that as like showing too much feeling and emotion. And it's so sad to see that. And then you see them in adulthood. You know, I catch them in adulthood. They're in adulthood, and what the outcome of that for a lot of men is, right? And obviously, it's a spectrum. Is like some men they really struggle just to make friends. Like male friendship is like this thing that's like a real problem for them. And then when they're in relationships with straight men, or in relationships with women, they're in these relationships and they don't know these emotional cues, these social cues that happen in a relationship. Like, oh, she's asked me how I feel, but he hears that question as, oh, if I say how I feel, I'm going to be attacked, because that's what happened to me when I was in like grade school or junior school. And they never realized, they never learned that actually those feelings and the way they were brought through society into young men doesn't work for relationships, because there's also this kind of simultaneous effect that in the working world, those ways of being, especially in the corporate world, are kind of praised. Like if you're a bit cold and ruthless and so forth in the corporate world, those ways are praised. So these men are experiencing these disconnected relationships and friendships, but then they have this material success in the workplace.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, another outcome of that is that when men are so emotionally starved in their entire social world, if they have a female partner, they often rely on that female partner for their entire emotional like support, because they don't actually know how. Like they feel like they are not allowed to get emotional support from elsewhere, you know? And then due to their own emotional stunting, they're not very good at providing emotional support back to the woman, you know?
Yeah.
And so she has to hold that weight of like lifting him up and like taking care of him emotionally. Well, for her, she's getting the majority of her emotional support probably from other women, from her friends, you know? And so that creates a weird situation for women where they're super burnt out and they're like, I don't have the energy. And it causes a lot of resentment in relationships, and men often don't understand why. But a huge thing is that men need friends. Like, men need relationships with other men. They need closeness. And like it is heartbreaking to me that, like, for so many men, the access to touch, for example, that they have comes only through sex. And they don't experience like any platonic care or touch in their lives, which is like, we are social animals. We have a deep biological need for that, right? And so if that's the only place that you're going to access that, it obviously contributes to like this hyper focus on sex and this valuing of sex. But it's like, you know, you're supposed to be being touched in other contexts, and men deserve that. And like, I've talked to men too, like being a queer woman, like I'm bisexual, but I date men, and being like a feminist, but being a feminist who like has compassion and understanding for men. You know, men open up to me, and like men have told me that a lot of times in sex with women, like they don't really get touched like all over their body.
Yeah.
You know, like there's this sense of like focus on the specifically genital, the specifically sexual, like, and not like a sensual, full bodied kind of touch. And men are actually like longing for that. But that socialization around gender also leaks into the relationship with women, and women are also socialized to think about men this way, as like that it's feminine for men to want to be touched. And I'm just like, oh, this is so dysfunctional. This is not helpful for anyone. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, then there's, just to kind of add to that, is like, so there's the men who have become hyper focused on sex, right? Because that's the only place they can get touch and feel like, and they don't even know that they need touch. They just, most of them, they just I want sex. I want more sex. Like, I definitely say in my 20s has definitely lived in that place. And then there's kind of also a flip side of men who like, they're scared of sex. They get anxious about sex because it's almost so important to them, and this thing that they can feel this yearning for, that they're terrified. And it's almost like there's those men there who live in that kind of realm and world. And I've worked with plenty of these guys, and they almost don't, it's almost like the world doesn't think they exist, right? Because the world sees men as like sex hungry beasts. And, and actually what's really missing for them is this ability to be in touch, be in contact of what I often have to explain to them is like non-sexual physical intimacy with other men and other people, be that like family or friends. And I one of my theories is one of the reasons, two reasons I see this is like why men love sport so much, because sport is one of the few places where you'll see men touching each other and you'll see men expressing emotion. Like it's perfectly okay for a man to win a football game, soccer in my world, and hug his teammates, kiss his teammates, right? And be overjoyed of emotion to the point that he may even cry. And we all go, yeah, that's cool. We love that.
And we clap. Yeah.
But if he was to be on the street in the middle of the day with some friends, so overjoyed in the streets, we'd be like, what the fuck's going on with these guys? Like, are they dangerous in some way? Like, do we need to avoid them? Are they going to get crazy in some way? And I find that really interesting to see. Like, obviously there's context for different things, but like we allow men to express through sport and joy and tears. But in the daily life, like, is there really has the world really evolved to the point where a man can really go into the office and be like, hey, I'm really struggling today, burst into tears, and for everybody to still kind of look at him in the same way?
Yeah, totally. It's very, 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 like people are like, what are you doing, man? Hold it together. Like, it's like weird. Like people don't feel comfortable with it. And that is such a stunting of the full range of human expression. I also think, to go back to what you were saying about the men who have fear of sex or they're very overwhelmed by it, I think part of it too is that something that we don't talk about, but that I believe is true, is that in heteronormativity, all of the like responsibility for action, like taking initiative and making things happen, falls on men. And there's this expectation to be the one who makes things happen, to have to have the confidence, to be assertive, to seduce, right? And this is actually hard to do. Like it's something that is not necessarily that easy. And like as a bisexual woman who dates women, and I often date other bisexual women who date men and who are used to dating men. One of the things that is very difficult for bisexual women is that both of us are like, okay, so who's the one who's going to take on that role? Who's the one who's going to take on the vulnerability and the risk and the responsibility of being the one to take action, you know? And sometimes it's very stressful. Like I have often found myself in that position of being like, oh my God, like I don't understand what's going on. Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And it's all kind of on my shoulders. Otherwise, nothing is going to happen, right? And I think that role is vulnerable. And since men are not allowed to express vulnerability and are not allowed to say, this is stressful, this is confusing, I don't necessarily feel that confident, I feel like overwhelmed. Like, since all of that is seen as like, you know, emasculating and like it's not appropriate for men under this culture to express that, I totally get why there would be a subset of men who are just like, this whole thing is stressful. I don't really want to do it because it's too much pressure.
Yeah, and it's beautiful that you point that out because it's interesting. An old friend of mine I knew years ago, she was gay, and I remember once we were at this self-development program and we were having a joint at the end of the evening, which we definitely weren't meant to be doing. And I was like, we'd kind of been in this thing for a few months, and I was like, oh, like, how's things, man? How's your love life going? And she was like, David, I could just do with some sex. I was like, oh, really? She goes, yeah. I said, can't you just go and get some sex? And she was like, David, imagine two women coming together. Imagine how much stress and effort it is for them to actually make it happen. And she looked at me and I smiled and we just burst into tears of laughter, right? Because I was like, oh my God, yeah. Like as you were saying there, that there's so much pressure on a man to initiate sex.
Yes.
And like, this is in relationship, I see this a lot with men, is like, they feel so much pressure that they don't even want to initiate. But it is this super stressful thing because there's no map, there's no playbook.
Yes.
There's this like ever moving flow of energy in the air, and you've got to catch the right thread and follow that, and maybe not follow that because you get a no, or is that a terminal no? Is that a no, not for right now?
Totally.
And the men feel this kind of stress of sex. And as you said, it's not, we don't deem it like quote unquote manly to talk about that stress, that worry. And totally. I see a lot with men in relationship is that if they have a particular fear of rejection, or they're between them and their partner, they're not great at like talking and communicating, or if the partner has indicated, when I say indicated, that could be anything from like a look to said outright that like they don't like the way that they're initiating sex or something like that, then it really puts them into a state of like stress equals sex. Sorry, sex equals stress. And they're like, I don't want stress in my life, you know, so they stay away from it. And this creates a really difficult dynamic in kind of heterosexual relationships. But it's interesting there that you were pointing out about, you know, being in a relationship with women, because it's like, yeah, like the initiating is such an ingrained part sexually for us, or even relationally for men. It's like they have to initiate, like they have to arrange the date, they should initiate the sex, they should move things forward. But there's also then a lot of negative rhetoric around men, around those areas, like, oh, he shouldn't have hit on me. How dare he have hit me on this time? Like he's you know, all of those areas is like, it's fraught with danger. I often say this to my clients, it's like, there's such a vulnerability in taking action in that we often forget about.
Totally. And with the new, like, you know, conversations around consent, and now we are starting to have more understanding about things like coercion, and things about like poor communication, poor consent practices, sex that is like, you know, ranging from like not good for women to like traumatic for women. And so it's good that we're starting to have those conversations. But we sort of just drop the ball when we're like, okay, so suddenly we just are expecting men to have these skills when we haven't actually done anything to teach men these skills, right? Or to allow men to to have the emotional range and attunement necessary for those skills to work, right? And so it's like a big part of consent is attunement, like to actually know if what you're doing is wanted, you actually have to be paying close attention. And you have to actually be able to read body language, like looking at signs, and you actually have to be comfortable with no. Like you have to, and you have to be welcoming that no, and also like be curious about what the no might mean. Like, is the no, I'm not interested at all? Is the no, I'm not interested in this particular thing, I want to do something else? What is that about? And when we define masculinity through this idea of like conquering and through this idea of like never experiencing rejection, to experience rejection can fill men with shame, can fill men with this like extreme shame. And then they're not really open to the no because they're scared of it, right? And I think we're all scared of it to some way or another, because rejection is difficult for human beings. It's vulnerable and it's difficult. And we don't really teach people, like we're like, yes, make sure you get a yes, but we don't teach people what to do with a no, or how to handle a no with grace, how to handle our own emotional reaction to no. But yeah, we've really put men in a weird spot with like defining masculinity in this way, not teaching them any of the skills of attunement, and then now getting upset, and also putting all the pressure that you're the one in charge, you're the one who's going to be initiating, and then getting upset that men don't know how to do that. And there's a lot of like miscommunications and poor consent going on. And so like, I think the conversation is very important. It needs to happen, but it also needs to happen in a way that is not just scapegoating men and blaming them, but is actually trying to resource men and like step men into an experience of sexuality that is better for everyone, including better for them. And another piece of this too, that is complicated and doesn't get talked about enough, is that men can say no. Men don't always want to. And this is also like masculinity is defined as always being down for sex.
Yep.
And so the idea that a man could not want it is like basically not considered, and like, even though, men hold the responsibility of being the ones who initiate, like culturally, that doesn't mean women never initiate. Women sometimes do. They just don't hold that like social role. But the thing is, and I've come across this with like the education work I do with bisexual women, is that part of the reason that bisexual women are so anxious about initiating with other women is because they're very scared of accidentally crossing a boundary. They're very scared about doing something that's unwanted. But they tend not to hold that same fear with men because they hold this implicit belief that he probably does want it. He probably is down because we have been socialized to believe that men always are. And like, again, I've heard stories from men about women doing things without communication, without asking, even like crazy things, like just like initiating penetration without a condom, without checking about that, right?
Yep.
And like that is actually a sexual assault. Like that is something that you just crossed a major sexual boundary without any communication, where if you did that to a woman, that's a sexual assault. So it's a sexual assault if you do it to a man too. And so there is also, I think, a lot of just not a lot of space. If you can't say no, if there's no room in the cultural imagination for men to not be interested, to not be down, to not be in the mood, that also means like how like his yes is also not fully real either, because a yes can't be really real in the context without the possibility of a no.
Yeah, totally. And it's the assumption that a man wants sex, but then what I've also see is, and I speak to some of my clients or women that I coach, is like the reaction the women have when a man says no. And this is like super interesting when you get to dissect this, because like, and I speak to men and I speak to women, and like I've had men who've literally experienced rage from women, questioning of the masculinity, or it's like, don't you find me attractive? Like all these kind of rhetorics that kind of come from the unconscious, that we've just assumed that, men all want sex. And if they don't, then it means there's either something wrong with him, right? There's something wrong with his libido. There's something wrong with his masculinity, or the woman experiences it as a personal attack of like, then there must be something wrong with her.
Yeah.
And it's really fascinating when we look at it through that lens, because it's like, that's really what we don't speak about. Like, how do, like, a man's yes is, a man's no is also an important part of consent. It's not his job to always be seeking consent. Like, if he says no, we can also be curious, like, oh, like, are you okay? Like, is it you a no to this particular thing? But I've seen this with speaking to clients and women, is like, women often can't hold the no. They can't be with the no. The no instantly becomes like a response, a big emotional response to that feels personal, or that they need to kind of attack back.
Totally. And I think, like, you know, on the women's side of things, so much of women's self-esteem, self-image through heteronormativity and sexism is based in their concept about being desirable, right? Yeah. And so to experience the situation where you're not being defined as desirable by someone who you thought you were going to be defined as desirable, like, that can bring up shame. And that shame can be very unbearable. And then also, I think something happens with women where, unfortunately, because, like, for a few reasons, because women are taught to be passive, they're taught to be receptive, and also because sometimes they are kind of afraid of men, not even because that guy has done something scary, but because men in general have done scary things. Women are often, like, sort of tiptoeing around what they're afraid men might do, right? And so women often cross our own boundaries because we are afraid about what happens if we are assertive and we say no, right? Like, is that actually going to work? Is it better if I just sort of appease and go along with this, even though I'm not super into it? So women do a lot of that in relationships, a lot of people pleasing and self-betrayal and crossing our own boundaries. And so I think sometimes if a man asserts himself with a no, another thing that can come up for a woman is resentment. Like, oh, so you're going to set a boundary, but I've just been here crossing my own boundaries over and over again. And I have done things that I didn't want to do, but because I felt like I had to, and now you're going to set a boundary. So I think that is also work for women to do on her side of the street around getting more assertive, more confident with setting boundaries. And I also think, you know, part of the work that men need to do collectively is that, you know, the threat of sexual violence that women live under, it sucks, because it's like, even a guy who would never do something like that, or who is not going to be a threat physically to a woman, he's living in the shadow of men who are, you know, and that threat that women are constantly negotiating, especially in their intimate lives where they're vulnerable, it affects their behavior. And so, you know, it's all well and good to tell women, like, we need to learn to be more assertive. We need to learn to stand up for ourselves. And we do. But we also need men collectively to be talking about this problem of violence, because it affects everybody, including men who aren't violent, because women are more likely to assume that they might be, right? Because they might be. There's no way for her to know yet, you know?
It's safer to assume that he may be violent than, or it can be thought that it's safer to assume that he could be violent instead of thinking that he won't be. And it's funny. It brings me to something that I often talk to men about, is like, there are men who are really oblivious to that weight that women carry of this constant unerring fear and worry about sexual assault and sexual violence. And I also run men's circles for a company, and it's as a topic, it kind of comes up quite frequently. And there's usually always, you know, if there's anything like 10 guys, there's usually 1 or 2 guys who are like, oh my God, I've never heard about this. I didn't know this. Like, and you're like, oh, do you have any sisters? And they're like, yeah, but we don't really talk. Do you have any female friends? No, not really. Like, have you got a partner? They're like, yeah, but like, we don't really talk about, you know, politics and stuff like this. And it's like, I really 100% agree. I think it's really the body of this work for men is to be in spaces of other men that can tell them stories and tell them experiences that they can learn, but also to be curious with the women in our lives, if they're open to this curiosity, like, to talk about, it'll be like a space for where we can listen, like this, you know, holding of space where, like, your partner can come to you and go, oh, look, I was walking down the street and this sketchy guy was walking behind me, and then I started to worry about that he may do X, Y, and Z. And in that moment, holding space is like, oh, like, what were you thinking? Like, how are you feeling? Is this something you want to talk about some more? Like, being curious and getting more. Holding space is not going, oh, you don't need to worry about anything. Like, nothing's going to happen. And that's a
Yeah.
really important thing, because as men, I think we often, because of the emotionality that we don't have, we struggle with the empathy. So it's like, oh, we can't imagine what it would be like to be a woman.
Right.
So we can't step into those shoes, oh, I'm fearing for my sexual safety. Like, I always say to, like, I've got like my black friends, I'm like, it's much easier for us, especially now, like I'm 39 years old and I grew up in the UK, and there was like National Front, and you could risk being beaten up at 14 years old for just walking down the street. You know what it's like to fear for your safety by just going about your day-to-day business, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can kind of like have a conversation with a man. But there's some men who've never had this experience of worrying about their safety. Maybe they're large guys, my height, white, and the world just seems like a really safe place. And sometimes it's hard for them to step into that empathy of like what it could be like to be constantly fearing that someone's going to like hurt you, take advantage of you, or sexually assault you.
And I think it's also the dissociation from their own vulnerability, because it's like, to know that your own vulnerability is like, you're not allowed, because all men were children once, right? And I'm like, when you were a child, you were small. You were small and you were vulnerable. And so, maybe you were lucky enough to be in a situation where you were relatively safe. But, most men, like, have experienced some kind of bullying or some kind of something in their childhood where they felt overwhelmed and they felt vulnerability. And that dissociation from that, of like, I can't allow that emotion in, it makes sense to me that it would be kind of like affronting to like actually hear about the experience that women have of carrying this vulnerability around with us all the time, and being very aware of that vulnerability, where men are like, what? There's no vulnerability. Because to be like, nothing was going to happen. It's fine. Like, I see how that is echoing things that men have heard in their socialization. Like, why are you being a baby about it? Like, man up. And so, yeah. And I think that men would, I don't know, like, when I hear all of this fucking like pickup artist bullshit and these like advice that men give men to like try to get laid or whatever, I'm always like, this is so horrible, because it's like, it's so the opposite of what is actually helpful for obviously healthy relating. But also, if you want intimacy with women, like, women don't want to be manipulated and coerced. And women are also looking for like intimacy and connection. And like, one of the best ways to get intimacy and connection with a woman is to create conditions where she feels safe.
Yes.
To create conditions where she knows that her no is welcome, and it's like, any man who can do that well, and who is like actually attuned and interested, that doesn't mean that every single woman is going to want to sleep with him, but like, it's not like a foolproof thing that like you're just going to get laid by any single woman. But like, when you make a connection with someone and you present that safety of like, yeah, like, I want to know you as a person, and like, I'm not trying to get something from you. I want to have like, intimacy that is reciprocal, and like, I want to make sure like that you feel comfortable to say no, and that I'm respecting that. Like, I'm like, that is going to be so much more effective than what any of these pickup artist guys tell you. And I want men to know that,
It's I many years ago, way like 15 plus years ago, I involved myself in the pickup world, right? Way when I was a young boy. And what I saw was, it was very interesting, because what I saw a lot was these men who'd learned all these lines and these ways of like talking to women in particular contexts, right? Like a bar, a club, on the street. But what would happen to them is that they would be able to get through those, we'll call them milestones, checkpoints, first few dates.
Yeah.
And then they had nothing. They were shells of men, right? Because they didn't actually have a life that they could be like, hey, I love skateboarding. Like, come skateboarding with me. Because their life wasn't skateboarding. Their life was going to bars and trying to like practice their pickup stuff. And it was really interesting for me to be in an environment with those men and meeting them, because like before I met them, was like, my whole thing was like, I want to live an awesome life. I want to travel the world. I want to see stuff and do stuff. And I always remember a guy that was running a workshop, and he was just like, you always have stuff to say. And I was like, what do you mean I always have stuff to say? He was like, you never like run out of stuff to say when you're talking to women. I was like, yeah, I just talk about my experiences, the things I've done with my life, and I talk about them, and I'm interested and I'm curious, blah, blah, blah. And he was like, wow, okay, so you don't like have stories you have pre-made. I was like, no, I don't. Like, these stories I'm telling you about, me like being in Brazil, like that actually happened because I went out and I've lived my life. And he was like, wow, okay, so that's another way of doing it. And I I work with guys now, right? Single guys, and they're often like, okay, like, I want to meet more women and da da da. And I always say, learn to listen. Like, learn to listen, not just to the words.
Mm,
Listen to the space in between the words. Listen to the
mm,
conversation that's happening underneath the conversation. I was like, because when you learn to do that, most women are really attuned well to like the conversation under the conversation. And when you learn as a
mm.
man to be able to have that conversation where you might be talking about pineapples, right? You're talking about pineapples on your date, but there's an undertone of just this eros in the conversation about pineapples. No one's saying anything particularly suggestive, but it's all communicated through a look, through the slightest of touch,
Exactly. The
for a pause on
attunement.
a word. That is really what elevates a man into being like, God, I don't want to use that term. Sometimes words come. I was going to say high value man, but I hate that term. But it's like a desirable man, right? Because he is attuned to the moment, right? He's attuned to
Yeah.
the moment, like the energetic flow of the moment, the words and everything in between. And he's also attuned to the person in front of him. And
Yes.
then the assumption I imagine for women, maybe that's conscious or unconscious, is like, when I am in bed with this man or in a sexual interaction with this man, he has the same level of attunement, which means that
Exactly.
I will be able to be in my I can be very nonverbal and still feel safe because he's attuned to the moment. He's going to attune to my pleasure, what I enjoy, my desire. He's going to take care of me. And in fact, that is the thing. And listeners, this is not a method for you to get laid a lot, but this is what actually, this is what actually
Totally.
women really want. But there's also a really strange opposite to this, is like, there's a lot of women that don't know that's what they want, and they don't realize because they haven't
Yes.
experienced it as well, and they've experienced something very different, and they've had
Totally.
crazier relationships and so forth. So I just thought it's important to say that it's like, this is the deeper desire of human beings, is deep, like
Yes.
heartfelt, authentic, heart open safety and connection. But because we've been so schooled in this like third class citizen of like status and money and transactional relationships, we think that that's all is really possible.
Totally. And I think, with that, with what you're describing, I think I agree like 100%. You're totally right. This attunement is like really what is desirable, and especially for women with the experience of having so much lack of attunement with men, which does lead to dangerous situations where like they don't feel like their consent is actually being listened to because the man is not listening, not just to their words, but to their body language and to what they're actually expressing. So women want that. And, that is 100% the surest fire way to get a good connection going with a woman. But it also opens you to vulnerability. It doesn't promise you the way that the pickup artist thing does, which it's false, but like it gives you this fantasy of like, this is just an equation. And when you follow all the steps, you get sex at the end. Like you put the money in the slot and then sex comes out at the bottom, like that's how simple it is. And that fantasy avoids vulnerability.
Yeah.
Because it means you don't have to risk rejection. You don't have to risk a no. You just have to follow the steps. And so with this method, which is you're far more likely to actually succeed because this is like actually attractive and actually like what women are looking for. But for whatever reason, that particular woman and you might not vibe, right? So when you're opening that like attunement and you're listening and you're like paying attention to her energy, you might find that there's a lot of like building like connection and electricity there, and it might go really well. Or you might find that you guys are not vibing and there isn't a natural chemistry there, and what you're picking up when you're attuning is actually a no. And so men are scared of that because it's vulnerable. I mean, everybody's scared of that, but like men especially, because of the this socialization around, oh my god, vulnerability is so terrifying. To open yourself to that is really scary. And so I think men are just hoping there's an easier way around it. And I mean, damn, I'm fucking hoping for it too, man. Like I get it when I do this exact same experience, right? Like when I'm the one who's being in the role of the initiator, I feel that vulnerability where I'm like listening and I'm attuning and I'm opening my heart. But like, yeah, like to do that and to feel that other person not being interested or to withdraw or to reject is very vulnerable. But unfortunately, there's no way around it. That's just what it is. And you have to get good at being as comfortable as you can with rejection, as comfortable as you can with like, and part of it is like knowing that like there's actually nothing hot about like trying to have sex with someone who's just simply not into it with you. It's just actually not hot. And so it's fine. Like, it's better to find out that this is not a good fit. And, it's not saying anything about you as a person. It's just, this is not a good fit. The energy is off between you two, and you can go find somebody else that it is going to be a good fit. And that's going to feel a million times better.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to have this joke is like, I wish all men reached the point in their ability to attract and sleep with women so that they could attract and sleep with not any woman, but women, a decent percentage of the women they're attracted to. So then they could relax that part of themselves and they could fall back into like, okay, like what do I really like? What do I really appreciate? Because the drive to just get laid for some men is so intense because it happens so infrequently for them that it takes over like their whole mind, and then they're not able to look at the kind of like more important things when we're looking for connection, right? And relationship. Like,
Totally.
Does this person communicate well? Do they respect me? Like, are they kind? Like, do they like animals? Like, whatever it is for you, it's like we can be so clouded by lust, right? That
Totally.
we miss the really important parts of like what creates a deeper, more meaningful relationship.
And I think women and men can both do this, where we objectify the other person and we look at them for like what we think they mean, whether it be like, their physical appearance or their status. And when we're looking at people in this objectifying way, we're not really seeing their humanity, which really blocks us from being able to have like an authentic and really satisfying connection. And, I think for as much as men, the like, they're like the incel type, like they complain that women only want this certain type of man. Well, they go around only wanting this certain type of woman, right?
Yes.
And they have these ideas of desirability that are like narrow, and they don't actually look at different kinds of women who might look different kinds of ways, and actually still be really desirable if you actually like paid attention to her and got to know her and felt the connection between. But just because she doesn't look like a model or something does not mean that she doesn't have, that she isn't hot, that she doesn't have something to offer, that you guys couldn't have a really hot connection. And same with women. If whatever it is that women are objectifying men for about status or about like whatever, same thing, like you might be passing up, a really good connection with someone. And so like my hope is that people will just try to like see each other's humanity, because it's when we see each other's humanity, that is where the real eroticism and the real connection, the real chemistry is going to flow. And it might come from someone that you really didn't expect and you didn't think was your type, right? And I think people need to like free themselves from that whole framework and actually just see where attraction leads them when they're not keeping it shackled under like, these preconceived notions of desirability.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah. It's something I preach to men a lot. Is like look past the superficiality of it, right? Look past the superficial picture, like hair color and height. Like, let's look past that and be like, what's the deeper truth that you really want? Like, what do you want? And I'm lucky. Most of the men I work with want relationships. And I'm like, you want a relationship? What sort of relationship are you? And then I love, this is one of my favorite questions. In 15 years time, when you're married, right? Is her looks going to be the thing that like helps you get through difficult times and arguments? Like,
Totally.
Or is it going to be their willingness to engage, their ability to communicate, like their compassion and their open-heartedness? Like, let's focus on the things that really matter. But like you said, we have to drop. It's like this like part of it's like ego, and it's part of all these beliefs that have been piled on top of us of like what we should have or how what other people will perceive us, so that we can like actually come to an authentic sense of like, what do I find attractive? And I think this kind of speaks to what you said earlier about men and their feelings and emotions, is like, if we can't really feel, right? You can't really feel the subtlety and the nuance of life and presence and so forth. There's two things I observe in men. They struggle to know purpose and what they want to do, their deeper meaning in life. But they often then also struggle to know, do I like this woman in front of me? Do I like, there's always this like, I'm not sure. And then I guess when that happens for a lot of men, they fall back on what society tells them or what they've been indoctrinated into their society and their culture of what's attractive and so forth.
And I think it's useful, like, you know, because it's, you know, it's not that masculinity and the qualities associated with masculinity are bad or a problem. There's many positive aspects of masculinity about, like, you know, a healthy masculinity that is like assertive and knows what you want and is willing to stand up for what you want, even in the face of other people detracting it, you know, but that is still flexible and curious. And I think it's interesting because, you know, I have an unusual kind of like gender presentation as a woman because I'm a queer woman and I don't really follow the rules of like heteronormativity, right? So, and I just cannot be bothered with this. I don't wear makeup, I don't shave, and like, but I'm like a confident woman who like embodies my femininity in a different kind of way because I'm not shackled under heteronormativity. And so it's been interesting dating straight men, right? Because the straight men who are really freaked out by that, they always want to pretend that all straight men are freaked out by that to make themselves feel better about the fact that they're freaked out by it, right? And like to be like, oh, you know, like as a man, I'm just not comfortable with a woman who whatever, like doesn't shave or who like, and I'm like, as a man, I'm like, sorry, I have been with many men. I've had many relationships with straight men. And there's a great many men who are not threatened by it. There's a great many men who are able to be attracted to that. And it's fine if you're not attracted to it. But don't fall back on this thing that it's because you're a man and men can't be attracted to that. And in fact, like a very empowered like masculinity that is like very like a man who's sure of himself in that way and isn't worried about what other men are thinking about the woman that he chooses to be attracted to or the woman that he chooses in his life. Like, you know, to me, I'm like, that's hot. That's like an empowered masculinity where he's like, I don't care what you fucking think. It's actually like, and it feels a lot better because it's like, you're not dating the dude who's like talking shit about you. You're dating her, right? So like, who cares what he thinks? Like, if you're attracted to her and you feel good in that connection and she makes you feel good, it doesn't really matter what like other dudes are saying or thinking about it.
Yeah. And it's interesting, this concern about other men. And I guess it kind of, and you say that, it kind of reminds me of the man box is that as men, we, because we don't attune ourselves to our environment and our own feelings, we get our cues from what other men think. That's how we decide we know what's right or wrong because of the bullying we experience. But as a man, if you start to then go like, okay, I've met this woman and she doesn't shave, right? She has long hair under her armpits. Now, I say this because like I encouraged my girlfriend to stop shaving during lockdown because she was like shaving one day and I'm like, why are you doing that? And she's like, because that's what I do. I was like, but no, why are you doing that? And she goes, well, like, do you want me to stop? I was like, you're free to do what you want. I was like, but don't feel you have to do this because of me. Like, you do you. Like, I will love and care for you whether your armpits have long hairs or not. Yeah. And she was like, oh, and then it was a very interesting thing here with us is because she then went through the process of growing them and like, I don't want to show it to you because I think that you're going to think that I'm not sexy. Wow. And then we would talk about it and I'd be like, actually to me, like, I just be free. Like I got nothing. I've gone through the whole process of like, God, why do I think that hairy armpits are bad? Why do I think they're disgusting and gross? Like, oh, wait a minute. That's bullshit. That's just something that someone told me at some point in my life and I keep seeing everywhere. And all the standards of beauty that I see in magazines and TV and movies have shown me that this is the thing. Can I trust that cookie cutter that I've been shown? I know I can't trust that because I've lived my life as a black man who's traveled the world and done all these things that are outside the cookie cutter. So, I can release that. I can let go of that judgment and let myself just be a little bit more free from the assumptions of the world. But I guess for a man who hasn't really come to his own sense of him and his own feeling for himself, like being with a woman, I wonder this. It's like being with a woman who doesn't shave her armpits, for example. Is that like a threat to his identity?
Well, what I have found that is actually, I think would be surprising to a lot of people is that I think a lot less men care about it than we think that they do.
Yeah.
And so I think that the men who do care about it are really caught up in this idea that, well, men care about this. But I'm like, I'm 37 years old. I've been dating men for a long time, and like I have not shaved my armpits this whole time, right? So I have a very broad case study here of like most men do not care, but we are just like actually we are conditioned to believe that they do. Right. And so this results in women, doing things that they don't necessarily want to do because they're trying to please men. And also it results in like men like thinking like, am I weird for not caring, or am I weird for even being attracted to this? And then men who really struggle with it can fall back on this idea that it's well, I'm a man and men don't like this. And I'm like, well, speak for yourself, and I think a lot of men do. And it's like, it's just that's not, I don't know, like, because honestly, in my entire sexual history, there's been like 3 guys that had a problem with it. And I think that would really actually surprise a lot of men. But those men were like, it's because I'm a man and men have a problem with it.
Wow. Oh, men sometimes. It's so funny how we take on these ideas of society and then we just kind of amalgamate them into our minds. Mm-hmm. And we're like, this thing is true. This is how it is, Mm-hmm. Like, I remember an experience. I went to a Tantra retreat and a couple of years back, and part of the Tantra retreat was like, as men, we stood around in a circle. We did like a men's circle naked. And I told one of my friends about this, and I was like telling him how beautiful the experience was, hearing these men share so vulnerably, blah, blah, blah. I told him the whole thing. And the first question he had for me was just like, why would you stand in a circle of men naked? And I was like, almost shocked by the question, because I was like, oh, wait, I said all this other stuff.
Yeah.
But it's sometimes we're so indoctrinated with the way society's told us to be that we just can't get past these things. We've just taken them in as truth. Like, okay, for a lot of straight men, they feel scared and worried about being around other naked men and what that might mean, because, I generally think it's because in case they get aroused. Like, if I get aroused, if I get an erection and there's another naked man there, what does that mean? Like, what does that mean about me? And that's a lot that a man might have to unpack.
Definitely.
But it's interesting how we take on so many of these societal norms and ideas. All genders do this. And we kind of form this identity of who we are. And so often we refuse to really look at any of them. We just hold them as like, no, this is how it is. I refuse to kind of like look at this. Yeah. I refuse to question this. And I grew up my mum was a big church woman, not necessarily in size, but she loved going to church. And I always remember noticing this from a young age. It's like, at church, you can't question anything. There's no questioning of the scripture. Like, you can't be like, but could that have meant something else? It's like, no, you can't, you're not allowed to do that. And I've always wondered whether like, do these things have a correlation between like the way that we are, especially with religion? We don't question religion. You can't question the things that are said, blah, blah, blah. And how we then kind of take that on as ourselves, as our identity, and like refusing to question beliefs that we have about ourselves and the world.
Totally. And I think that it's so free and so liberating, to step outside of that and to be like, oh, I actually get to choose for myself what my values are, the types of relationships that I want to have, like the type of sexuality that I want to have. Like, I'm not constrained. And I think a lot of the reason that we feel so worried is just because we're social creatures and we don't want to be rejected. We don't want to be humiliated. We don't want to be abandoned by the collective. So we're like, okay, what are the rules? Like, I'll follow the rules, so I'll belong. But the paradox is that like there is no belonging when we can't be authentic, because we're belonging. Our belonging is contingent upon our following the rules and our pretending and our like making sure that we seem to be a certain way when maybe that's not who we really are. And so when we can truly be authentic, it's true. Like, we may lose connections. We may be attacked by some people. We may be rejected by some people. People might try to humiliate us or shame us. But like the people that we do find who are going to be our connections and our community and our belonging, those people are going to be accepting us for who we really are. And that is like incredibly more satisfying, even if it's a smaller group of people, because you get to be yourself, And so I want that for everybody. And I think there's something to be said about an empowered masculinity that really claims like No, I don't actually follow all that bullshit because I'm in charge of myself and I don't actually need to just do this because other men are saying that or because women are saying that's what a man needs to be. Like, actually, I'm a person and I get to be a person first, you know?
Yeah. And that is like, I think for me, it's a place to aspire to in oneself and as a constant self-reflection practice. And I was thinking when you were talking about the authenticity and like losing friends, it's like I sometimes laugh to my partner who's also a coach. It's like, you know, sometimes for people it's a really hard sell, you know, you'd be like, look, if you just go down this road of like really being sovereign about who you are and how you want to be, there's going to be a few people, you know, that don't like you. They're not going to want to talk to you and they're going to get angry about your opinions and stuff. But as you move down further on that road, it's going to be really amazing because you're going to meet people, like naturally attract people who are really in line with who you are. And your life is going to feel more fulfilling and more meaningful because of what you're doing is meaningful to you, not just meaningful for society and how society wants you to be.
Yeah, it's so worth it. 100% worth it.
What a conversation. Wow. I saw the time has flown there. I was like, it's like a I guess maybe it reminds me of like a basketball match. It's like just end to end action.
Yeah.
And I just love this. What a conversation. And I look and I'm like, oh man, there's so many things that we touched on, but I'll recap those later. And yeah, it feels a good place to stop because I will probably go on for another half an hour if we don't.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Where can the listeners get more of you? Where can they listen to you? Where can they read your books? Where can they listen to your podcast?
So my website is clementinemorrigan.com, and that functions as a newsletter. So you can sign up there and my writing will come into your inbox. So I post a lot of my writing there. And then also at clementinemorrigan.com, you can click on shop and there's like my books and my zines and my various like hard copy writing you can order there. I also have a podcast, which is called Fucking Canceled. And we talk about some themes that are related to the stuff we talked about today. And in particular, we look at cancel culture. And it overlaps with some of the stuff because we talk about consent and like call outs and how, you know, we don't have a good culture of consent, but we love to like, you know, just totally burn people at the stake without actually building the real tools necessary to like transform this culture. So there's a lot of that on Fucking Canceled. So it might be of interest to some of your audience. And then I have an Instagram where you can find some of my more short form writing, which is also just Clementine Morrigan.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. And I highly recommend nipping over to the Instagram, but I enjoy very much, I love reading your posts. And I also love, one of the things I really love about your posts is that you're like, if I don't follow you, I don't want to hear what you have to say. I love that because I'm like part of me is like, man, it would be so nice to not have to deal with some stupid fucking comments that you have to deal with sometimes. I'm like, man, she's got it right.
Boundaries. Yeah. It's people get real mad when you have boundaries, but it saves a lot of time.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to say a huge thank you to you for your wisdom and your like this refreshing, compassionate understanding and breadth of wisdom you brought today, and just super grateful to have you on.
It was a great conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. And listeners, we've pointed you in all the good places. If you've enjoyed this conversation, you've taken something from this, then, you know, get in contact. Let us know what you really learned, or go and read some more or listen to more, because it's always, you know, as content creators, sometimes it feels like you're just pissing into the wind and hoping that it went on someone's head, which is probably not the analogy that I wanted to go with. But listeners, I hope you've enjoyed the episode, and until next week, ciao, ciao. I want to say a big thank you for listening. You know, it's people like yourself that really help get the podcast out into the world. You know, especially if you're often sharing the episodes and the podcast with people that you feel just could do with listening, right? Can see a different way of being a man, maybe a different way of having dating lives and intimacy and relationships. So I want to say a big thank you. And if maybe after listening to this episode, you think, oh, there's someone actually you could really do with this, please share it with them. You know, share the love. I'm really, really grateful. And if, you know, you want to get in contact with me for any questions, or you want to talk about coaching or any working together, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at theauthenticman_. or you can email me hello@theauthenticman.net. Thank you very much.